Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about grids here in Figma. Now, we touched on grids lightly, I believe, earlier in the curriculum, but now we're really going to take a look at it specifically in relation to responsive design. So as you can see here, I have a blank document. Now, here on this same page that you're watching this video on, somewhere in the user interface, there's going to be a link in which you can download the file, the Figma file, after this video is done. However, I would prefer that you also follow along when you're watching this, because setting this up, it's going to help commit it much more to memory compared to if you were just to watch. So doing helps commit to memory more. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our frame here and we can just click over here. And I personally, when I start off designing a website, I start off with the full desktop mode, and then I work my way down. Now, some other designers, they prefer starting with mobile first and then working their way up. There's no rule that says you have to do either or. It's completely up to you. But for now, I'm going to start with desktop, and we'll just choose one of the largest ones right here. And I always like kind of dragging this up somewhere around 900 pixels for the height. Okay, so we're not actually going to do any design. Again, I just want to show you how to set up a grid across 3 different frames for different devices. So just so you could see the frames we're working with here, I'm going to make this one a fill color of pretty dark, right around 242424. And let's go ahead and add a grid. So we can see right here, it says layout grid, and we want to click plus to add a new one. And by default, it adds this little grid. It's kind of hard to see. If we click on these dots right here, we can go ahead and change the color to work with a color that works with our design much more. So in this case, we can just bring it right here for now. And you can see these grids. You can use this, but more often than not, you want to change this here to an actual column. And of course, you can see there are rows as well, which can help with your row placement. But the columns is what we want for now. And we want to change the count of the columns up to 12 here on desktop. So why 12? Well, it doesn't always have to be 12, but more often than not, a 12 column grid system is what many front-end development frameworks use. And what that simply means is when you design your website and you hand off your Figma file to the front-end developer whose goal or his job is to take your design and translate it into a working version on a browser or a smartphone or tablet, they possibly will be using a front-end framework system of some sort. And a lot of them use what's called a 12-column grid system. Sometimes they might be 16, sometimes they may be some other number. That's why if you're working with a team and you aren't responsible personally for the HTML and CSS, always confer with the designer first, if possible. That way they could tell you, hey, I'm using this front-end development framework. The number of columns that you need to use is going to be 12 here on desktop, and then maybe 8, and then 4. And so that's just one important thing. So the number of columns is important. Also, what's important is the margin. So the margin, if we bump this up, maybe we'll put it at 120. As you can see, it's just a margin around the entire grid system itself, so you have white space on the edges. And of course, when you're designing, you want to have that white space because you don't want all your elements right up against the browser, especially on a large desktop, like on a monitor. And so you can play with that as well, whatever you think is appropriate. And then also we have the gutter, which is the white space between each column here. So the gutter at 20 is pretty standard for your actual design here in your column system. And so just to refresh, what is the purpose of all of this? Well, simply put, when we're structuring our items, maybe like cards, maybe we'll have a card that spans 3 columns, and then maybe we'll have another one that spans maybe all the rest of the columns. And you can obviously mix and match these. And they're for you, it's really for 2 purposes. They're for you to be able to design consistently with an equal amount of white space between elements, but also it's to make the job and the life of a front-end developer easier when you're dealing with a grid system and they're used to using a grid system when they're creating their HTML and CSS. Okay, so now that we have that, this would be a perfectly acceptable grid system for us to use for desktop. Now, what about for tablet? All right, so the first thing we want to do before we create that frame, we want to come over here, these little 4 dots, and we can click plus to add this to our component library. And we're just going to call this desktop grid. We're going to create that. We're going to then take our frame over here and we're going to choose tablet. Let's just choose iPad Pro 11. All right, now you can see it's clearly not quite as big. We can change the color here. There we go. And then finally, we can come out here to layout grid, click the plus, the little style icon, and then choose desktop grid. But then we want to go ahead right here, and there's like a little broken link to detach the style. Because if we try to make a change here, it's going to end up making a change over here as well, or vice versa. So now we're just going to detach that, and then we're going to adjust this. So why on a tablet would we want to adjust situations here? Well, as you can see, there's a lot of white space, and typically the smaller you go in terms of the width of a design based on, going from desktop monitor to a tablet, you want less white space on the left and right because we simply don't have as much to work with. So we want to adjust that, and we can also adjust the number of columns as well, because typically speaking, when you're going from desktop, you have the full enhanced version, then we start to simplify things. And you'll see how this plays out and when we have context going forward. So if it's a little bit confusing now, don't worry, that's expected. So let's click here, and we're going to change this one to 8. And that's a common amount of columns for like around a tablet size, give or take, a couple hundred pixels. We also are going to change our margin perhaps to somewhere around 70. All right, so that looks pretty good. It gives us a certain amount of white space here, and that will work just fine. Now, by the way, type stretch, you can see center, right, left. Stretch simply means, and this is what you typically want to use, is if we drag this in and out, it's going to stretch appropriately. All right, and now let's do that one more time, and we'll do that here with the phone. And let's just choose iPhone 13 Pro Max. It's a quite large phone here. And again, the same exact procedure. I'm gonna hit I, grab that color. And then what we can also do is just simply choose the desktop grid again. Or actually, instead of doing that, let's do this to name these appropriately. We're gonna add plus for this. Sorry, we're gonna click on the grid styles, and we're going to add that grid style right here called, we can just call this tablet grid. We're going to create that style. We'll come over here, we'll grab the tablet grid, and then we will detach it. So for a phone grid, typically we're going to go from 8 from tablet down to 4. And again, this is all just suggestions. There's no laws that say you have to do any of this. Margin, maybe we'll reduce to around 40, maybe 30, maybe even 20. It all depends on the design itself. And here we go. So here is a responsive grid system, a column-based grid system that you can use going forward with your designs. Now, of course, things may change. You may adjust them accordingly, but pretty much this is going to be the flow that we use going forward.